Spiritual bypassing is a term that gets tossed around quite a bit. And if you're like me, I heard it quite a bit and I didn't really even know the definition. So I wanted to quickly define it before we talk about it. And so spiritual bypassing is essentially using spiritual tools and practices to avoid uncomfortable emotions, difficult situations, or just psychological problems. And a lot of people assume that because of the term spiritual bypassing, that it's not something that atheists can do. And from what I understand, atheists have their own way of spiritual bypassing, and we'll talk about that. For the longest time, even after understanding what spiritual bypassing was, I couldn't understand what the problem was. Like, why would you not use spiritual tools to avoid uncomfortable emotions? Like, that seems like what they're there for. But after a little bit closer inspection, what I've come to realize is that spiritual bypassing is the shadow side of spirituality. Let me explain with a metaphor. Last year I ran a 45-mile race, and it was the hardest race I've ever run. I'll link somewhere on the screen if you want to go watch the video that I made during the race. But when I was training for that race, I ran the Lewis Peak Trail quite a bit. And the Lewis Peak Trail is interesting because, you know, there's an initial climb, and then after that initial climb, you get out on a ridge. And the trail is unique in the sense that as it follows this ridge, every time you get to an opportunity to go up to a peak, you come to a fork. And at the fork, you can either go around the peak, or you can do the climb up to the peak and drop back down to the other side where you connect to that same trail. And when I was training for this race, I knew that this race was going to be difficult on the vertical training side. I knew that the course was going to require over 13,000 feet of elevation gain. And yet, even knowing that, while I was training, I would come to these forks, because I ran this trail all the time. I'd come to these forks, and I would always choose to go around the peak. And in my mind, I justify it. I'm like, I'm still getting out. I'm getting the mileage. I'm getting the hours in. I'm still building my endurance. I'm just going to go around. And I avoided the peaks that would have added some elevation gain to my runs and some elevation training. In similar fashion, I think we come to forks in the trail in our life, and when we arrive at these forks, we can either choose to bypass the peaks, the difficult trail that we need to travel. We can choose to either bypass them with spiritual practices or other tools, or we can choose to go up and confront the difficult emotions and the difficult situations and the psychological stress that we have. Similar to how when I was training for my race, going around was helpful. It was. I was still getting, like, the justification that I had in my mind. I was still getting the mileage in. I was still getting the time in and building endurance. I just wasn't doing the thing that I knew would really help me on this course. I wasn't taking those short climbs up to the peaks. And so that would be similar in a spiritual way to favor transcendence over embodiment, or to favor intuition over logic. Or you can switch those. You can favor intuition, or you can favor logic over intuition, or favor embodiment over transcendence. It's a both and that we need to do. And whatever path is the one that avoids the difficult situation, if we take that one, that's spiritual bypassing. And similar to the training decisions that I made while training for that race, if we make those decisions to avoid the difficult emotions, the difficult situations, those decisions tend to haunt us. And those decisions haunted me in my race, and it ended up being a very difficult day. And when it comes to the spiritual bypassing, those difficult emotions, those difficult situations, the difficult psychological issues that we have, those can often come up later in a similarly haunting way, and it can hurt us and it can hurt the people that we love that are around us. And honestly, that's kind of the thing that I'm trying to explain here, is that, you know, we all kind of justify these spiritual practices that we use in our head, and we're not wrong. Like, the things that we do to avoid these negative feelings, they're helpful, but they're also limiting. And that's what I'm trying to explain, is like, it's kind of like there's a good route, but there's also a better route, and the better route's not as pleasant, at least in the short term. Because like, we as people in general, we want to feel a sense of control over our lives, and we don't want to feel overwhelmed. And so these practices are something that we desperately cling to sometimes, for better or for worse. And I would argue that in the long term, it is for the worse. And so what I have found to be true in my life is that there's kind of like a third option. And it's not a third trail. You still come to a fork, and you still have to choose between spiritual bypassing and confronting the difficult emotions. But the third option would be to come to that fork and realize that you don't need to speed through it. You don't need to just continue running as fast as you can and go straight up to the top of the peak. What you can do is get to that fork and realize that you don't have to take the easy way around, but you also don't have to hurry up and go straight up. You can take 5 minutes or however long you need in real life to compose yourself, so that you can take that climb in the right state of mind and feel less overwhelmed while you confront the climb, while you confront those difficult emotions and the psychological situations that you might be in. And I'd really like to know if anyone else has had similar thoughts or a similar experience in their life to back up my idea there. If this is still muddy, I'd like to give a couple really quick examples of what spiritual bypassing can look like. Some of those are mantras, reciting scripture in your head, or singing a certain spiritual song, or prayer, or even meditation. All of these things can be done in the moment to avoid the emotions. And like I said, it's difficult because some of these things are helpful. And so it's really up to you to understand your intention. No one can understand your intentions. So do yourself a favor and be honest. Are you using these spiritual tools to confront the emotion in a healthy way? Or are you using these tools, these spiritual practices, to avoid these emotions? The second way that people can spiritually bypass is something called existential nihilism. And we've talked about nihilism before in other videos, but nihilism is the belief that nothing matters, or the belief in nothing. And so it's pretty easy to tell how easy it would be to bypass difficult emotions if nothing matters. And a lot of people attribute nihilism to be a uniquely atheistic problem, and in this case, a uniquely atheistic way to bypass emotions. But I beg to differ. Have you ever heard a religious person talk about how this life means nothing in the grand scheme of eternity? That this is just a blink of an eye. And then you see that same person go through something emotionally or psychologically difficult and completely bypass those emotions and say that they're only living for the next life. That is a prime example of bypassing, of spiritual bypassing. I want to leave you with one last thing, one last idea that I've been thinking about. And this is going to sound so cliche, but I want to say it anyways. When a caterpillar wants to turn into a butterfly, it doesn't just sprout its wings. When a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, it goes into its chrysalis, and it essentially deconstructs itself into mush. I heard someone recently describe it as pure biological matter. Like the caterpillar becomes no longer a caterpillar inside its chrysalis. It's just mush in there. And then out of the mush, it turns into a butterfly. And so it took the caterpillar to become not a caterpillar anymore. It took a massive change, a massive transformation for that caterpillar to become a butterfly. And so what I'm trying to say is, with spiritual bypassing, we can't just bypass that transformation. We can't just bypass the deconstruction. Not saying that we need to deconstruct anything. I'm saying we can't bypass the difficulty of confronting the emotions. We need to do that in order to grow. We need to confront the emotions in order to grow. Otherwise, we're going to be like a caterpillar that thinks that it's a butterfly and jump off the leaf, and we're not going to go anywhere. Anyways, I hope that was interesting for you. This concept of spiritual bypassing is something that I've thought a lot about. And so if you thought it was interesting, hit the like button, and I'll catch you in the next video.